Hello everyone, today we talk about the 1683 secondary Podolian-Moldavian front in the broader struggle between Catholicism and the Ottoman Empire. There is a lot of orthodoxy from both sides, as we will see now. And this is literally a forgotten story, right, of, in fact, the clash between, at large, like the Polish, Lithuanian, and partly, essentially, Ukrainian Commonwealth against the Turks in the aftermath of the siege of Vienna in 1683, involving also the Tatar allies of the Sublime Porte, and evolving in pretty brutal and dramatic ways throughout, in fact, the end of the same 1683 and the beginning of 1684. This was a pretty agitated frontier. It would remain for a while, given the quite decentralized position at the corner of these various polities. And in fact, one that would ignite basically by itself, as we will see now. You know that I've been making a lot of videos about Vienna 1683 and the general political, diplomatic, strategic background. We will talk also way more in detail about probably the Battle of Vienna. I made a video about that as a broader introduction. But this is really a very important part of history. I will probably resume the series on Prince again. And I think that talking about this Podolian-Moldavian frontier is necessary to understand the depth of the events. Because, of course, just like the destruction of the Ottoman forces at the gates of Vienna caused immediately a major shift, like in the balance of power of Central Eastern Europe and the Balkans. The campaign started with a few forces, but it sort of escalated in this dramatic confrontation. In 1683, overall, Podolia was not to play a major role. As you know, the entire deal of the siege of Vienna was making the King of Poland sending his robust forces to support the imperials against the Turks. You have there the most clamorously beautiful and glorious and important cavalry charge in the entire history of mankind. Some exception could be, Gaugamela or other accounts of Hellenistic feudal war, feudal, say, Western culture. But definitely for the modern age, this was clamors in itself. And we've talked about the Polish-Lithuanian army at this point in some old videos of Schwerpunkt, but you find the playlist there ready with lots of information. So I don't need to present again if not properly the order of battle in the area. In fact, at the beginning, both the Poles and the Ottomans maintained pretty contained force in Podolia, primarily focusing on the defense of various fortresses, obviously enough. By the summer of that year, Kamianets-Podilski, that was the center of the Turkish force, like the headquarters in the region, counted something between 2,500 and 3,000 soldiers. We're talking mostly Janissaries, but also local troops, including former Polish Tatars, including the Lipkas, that had defected, contrary to the majority actually of their people that, as you know, served gloriously at Vienna, so much so that their descendants still visiting the Austrian capital have a stray bundle over their heads. In memory of that, I made a video about Lipka Tatars that are a major chapter of Central Eastern properly European warfare, right? Islamic defenders of Catholic Poland. This would naturally play a role in igniting the hostilities as well. Kamianets was the main base, the most robust forces. Then there were other locations defended by much smaller contingents that, as a sum, in fact, would not give Alil Pasha, the commander of the Ottoman Podolian defenses, more than 4,000 soldiers in all. Right, this was kind of obvious. Everything was carried out pretty economically. This was not the main theater of the war with Poland and the empire. Actually, this was from the other side, across the Carpathians, and so hundreds of kilometers away. When you look at the Poles, in fact, in this southeastern frontier of their Commonwealth, they had even less troops, considering that they counted only 4 small infantry regiments, dislocated in the main centers of not just Podolia, telling the truth, also Galicia. You have Biała, Serkiew, Trembowla. These are the Polish names of these Ruthenian towns, Stanisławów, and then Lwów itself, Lviv. That was the most important center, but also more distanced from Podolia. We're talking again hundreds of kilometers. And so you understand that we're also pretty stretched. They were essentially militia. They had, in fact, in addition to these, say, regular regiments, infantry regiments, the Wybranieska infantry, that was essentially some royal peasantry, so they were called. It was essentially an old relic of medieval communal forces in Poland, mostly peasantry, because cities were not much of a deal. That the Polish kings had fostered in their autonomies and military organization to, with not much success, as you know, in the heavily oligarchic Polish reality, to counter, in fact, the Szlachta, the nobility. And so this states within the state that would, on the longer run, sort of erode the same power of the Commonwealth. In fact, they were just militias. There were also some pretty scarce private units, and they were there for whichever interest. Like here, there is a sum of lordships, as we'll see now, of figures also that were interested in the area from Poland, that would take matter in their own hands by having, some of their men scattered around. In any case, the pretty scarce force, actually scarcer than the Ottoman one. All right. There was naturally an expectation, as we will see, considering how the same campaign in 1683 evolved, that the Poles would have sent more troops, like especially the famous panzerni, and also lighter type of cavalry, in case of escalation. By the way, the local Ruthenians were pretty much habituated from a very long time to cope with nearly constant Tatar raids. Made lots of videos about, say, mostly from medieval history, but explaining also in the videos about the Polish-Lithuanian army, like more or less what was the role of the Cossacks, how the entire Commonwealth frontier worked in this enormous, vast area that opens to the steppes, and so also to the Crimean Tartars, to the Nogai horde, Ottoman vassals that control, in fact, the sea, also through Moldavia, that, as we will describe in a while, as a vassal of the Turks. What you realize is that the forces that the Poles could count on locally were just militias, and thus, essentially, they could be employed just for a defensive or most auxiliary purpose. The only mobile force that could be really moved to back like major operations was a contained contingent of cavalry banners from the regular army that at this point had also been preserved, just not to deplete it, and also conceived for essentially defensive operations still. This is the force that included both the panzerni and light cavalry. This was also deployable locally. It was led at the time by Andrzej Sierakowski, that had been fighting against the Ottomans and Tatars for a very long time, so it was really a veteran on the front as well. And additional forces would have had to come from Poland, and specifically from Krakow, had things gotten more serious. All right. The point, though, is that the Battle of Vienna was fought on September 11. At this point, all Polish forces, like say for a major regional effort, were concentrated there. Right. So the forces that the Poles could send had to first disengage from Vienna, sent back to Krakow, and then reaching Ukraine. There were some expectations also on the Cossacks that, as you know, lived in this vast stretch of the frontier, across sometimes also beyond the same control of the Poles, whereas we've seen some private units that could be mobilized in case. So that's what overall against the Ottomans that could be mobilized. As the Vienna campaign progressed until September the 11th, nobody was really doing anything there. There wasn't even an agitation. Like everybody was waiting, of course, for the outcome of the campaign. It would surely change the balance of power also in Podolia. But in fact, it's not until news arrived of the battle of September the 11th that things started to change, and pretty fast, right? We are at the end of September. It's like 10 days. Actually, news did not travel slowly at all at the time, but of course they had to be gathering consistent number, and so more details would unfold. Also, considering, as we will see now, that both say that where all these forces would be disengaged from the siege, also from the Ottoman side, that despite being defeated, could send some reinforcements in case also in Podolia had things agitated there, as it would happen, even though, of course, the Turks now had the lower end. In fact, what actually starts happening is that the same Podolian population starts rebelling against the Ottomans. Podolia had been controlled by the Ottomans only since the Treaty of Buchach, so we are 1672, the actual establishment of a new elayet, so this essentially Ottoman province, had been even more recent. So this was the concretely, as far as the Ottomans would actually send troops the most northeasternmost frontier. But one of great activity, considering the constant contrast with the Poles, the Ottoman authority starts wavering after the Viennese blow. The Podolian peasants literally start rising against the Turks. They begin a guerrilla insurgents assisted by the Cossacks that naturally were quite ready to mobilize the predatory forces. Plus also now some detachments of Polish cavalry that were, eager to shed Turkish blood. This warfare was not, again, this was not a major offensive, right? It was about targeting smaller outposts and garrisons cut off from the main bases. It was successful to the point that Ali Pasha, the local governor, as we've seen, decided to evacuate more vulnerable positions that would have in fact been lost that way. And it's not like Podolian peasants were quite tender, the Cossacks even less with the Ottomans. And so to concentrate them in Kamenets, because this magnificent fortress, I don't know if I inserted many pictures of it. It's one of my dreams to visit, as a matter of fact. And that made sense because, of course, if things were starting to go wrong, at least in this decentralized position, it was better to preserve forces, maybe also prepare to withstand a siege, which was unlikely to an extent from the Polish side, and wait for the waters to calm down and eventually trying to regain control of this lost avant-post when the situation would have been more favorable. Halil's card was, however, as it was really the case for the Ottomans in the same 1683 campaign in Vienna, to seek assistance from the Nogai and Crimean Tatars that in their ferocity were competing with the Cossacks, and that, of course, were in part also depleted by the major force that they had actually involved in Vienna. As we'll see now, the Ottomans would recall, given that in a sense they had to pass through there in the first place, some of the Tatar forces that were going away from Vienna, that had actually not distinguished themselves particularly, if not for the usual looting. I made some videos explaining that in that specific theater, and that, however, were difficult to control, unreliable. They were also, generally speaking, lighter, in the same Cossacks. So the major, say, violence began to escalate in a strategically relevant sense at the beginning of October, because a supply convoy escorted by a mix of Ottoman and Tatar soldiers was successfully ambushed and defeated by a Polish Cossack force under the Polish officer Sierakowski. Meanwhile, Andrzej Potocki, another Polish commander, we'll look at him briefly now, was gathering the remaining Polish forces available near Lviv. Potocki was the son of the Hetman Stanislav Revera Potocki. So these people were heavily involved in Ukrainian politics. They were appointed essentially by the Commonwealth with the negotiation of the Cossacks at the head of the latter. In 1660, Potocki became the great Shoroji of the crown, and later served as the voivode of the Kiev voivodeship from 1668, as well as the one of Krakow from 1682. He was really a very powerful person. He distinguished himself in the 1673 Battle of Khotyn. Potocki on this occasion commanded at the left wing of the Royal Army, one of the many battles of Khotyn, where he commanded the left wing of the same Polish Royal Army. After John II Casimir abdicated in 1668, Potocki strongly backed the candidacy of the Tsarevich Fyodor, which made him, by the way, unpopular among the Szlachta. He was also a member of the Confederation of Malcontents in 1672. That's how he took part in the Battle of Khotyn the following year. In 1674, Potocki was one of the electors for John III Sobieski, albeit he was opposed to the king's pro-French and anti-Brandenburg policy. You know that over the years things changed. Sobieski made a video specifically talking about John III essentially shifting his allegiance from Louis XIV to Leopold I of Habsburg, hence also the imperial alliance in Vienna. In 1675, Potocki played a key role in defeating the Tatars at the Battle of Kadush. In 1680, he was appointed governor of Krakow and became its castellan in 1682. And so we arrived to the year of the Battle of Vienna, in which the same Jan Sobieski appoints Potocki as the chief ruler of the entire Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the royal absence in Vienna. All right, so we're talking about a key figure that, in this case, had in fact to intervene in what was now, a favorable moment for the Commonwealth power to hopefully oust the Ottomans from the same Podolia. And that's why he gathers all these Polish forces in the main center of Galicia and moves down to Podolia with this. Potocki had received warnings from the same king about the potential return of the Crimean Tatars from Austria, right? And this was a huge issue because if the main Polish forces were still abroad, this could expose the Commonwealth to substantial raids into, its territory. And, the Tatars were not to accomplish much strategically, but they could cause extensive damage to the population, could alter, say, lots of political opinions. At the same time, nobody really knew what the Tatars were up to. Like, these were obviously always in for a bold raid, but Poland seemed too much, especially after the debacle of the Turks. Suffered by the Turks. Needless to say, nobody really knew what would have happened. The Polish defenses at the time were inadequate. They consisted of an assortment of regular and private units, again, panzerni and light cavalry, some infantry, then the Cossacks, and also Lithuanian troops that were primarily cavalry and were, however, even belating to show up, right? So, considering the broader weakness of the Ottomans in Podolia, Potocki opted to get over the possible Tatar concern and to actually go full in against the Turks. There was possibly like a very strong emotional reason why Potocki was doing this, given that his own son Stanislav had been killed at the glorious Battle of Vienna. So, scorching some Turk would have, in a sense, balanced things up a little. Potocki led a contingent of cavalry and infantry, accompanied by Lithuanians under Chodkiewicz, to his own hometown of Stanislavov, where he reinforced this division with cannons from his privately owned fortress there. This Stanislavov is not the today's town in Moldavia. It's actually Ivano-Frankivsk, a part of the modern city in Ukraine. And as we were saying before, that's how far and wide this Polish magnates control this, because, as you know, explained in the videos, essentially the main Ukrainian cities were Polonized, like the wide majority of the people was, so the peasant was Ruthenian, but let's say the Poles had essentially entrenched themselves as rulers in these major centers. Now, Potocki's forces were also joined by the former Moldavian voivode in Polish exile, that is Stefan Petrichek. This guy had been, in fact, voivode of Moldavia, as you know, was essentially like an Ottoman vassal, and that was, however, a bit complicated to rule. There were continuous overthrowings, as we will see now, including the one of 1674, that had expelled Stefan, that since then had been living in the Commonwealth. So the idea was, that Moldavia borders like in the southwest of Podolia. So if there had been a strong enough Polish Cossack punch to the Turks there, it would have been possible to break through their defenses and to actually carry out a regime change in the same Moldavia. And the idea was, of course, to reinstate Petrichek there as a pro-Polish candidate, reclaiming his own already obtained throne. The Ottoman governor Ali Pasha tried to counter Polish actions by sending a significant force led by Mustafa Aga to deliver reinforcements to Jazlowiec. It was a small yet well-fortified outpost, and Mustafa Aga succeeded in eluding the Polish Cossack horsemen, which was a feat in itself. These were at the command of the aforementioned Sierakowski, that in turn was essentially aiming to intercept them, to ambush them, cut them down. So Mustafa Aga leaves a contingent of infantry in Jazlovic and safely returns to Kamenets. Meanwhile, Potocki had been advancing with his soldiers from Stanislavov and laid siege to Jazloviec itself. So this was the point. The Turks replenished the center because they knew that the Poles would essentially besiege its castle. They were essentially just buying time because Potocki's efforts were almost successful. Hadn't the main Tatar forces moving from Vienna, escaping from Vienna, moving through Upper Hungary toward Poland, distracted him, prompting to abandon the siege of the local fortress to prioritize the defense of his fatherland. Now, the point is that nobody really knew what the Tatars, again, were up to. There was now a greater information regarding their intention to ravage Poland. But this attack would endly not materialize. At the time, the Poles did not know that, but they mobilized all available forces, including the Lithuanians and the Cossacks, that were brought at Buchach near the Stripa river. This gathering of forces was important because it was to stabilize the area around Lvov against the Tatars that would have essentially passed over the Carpathians and entered Galicia from there, devastating it. So the idea was to withstand this attack. In fact, Potocki instructed the Galician population to seek shelter in fortified emplacements to prepare for potential warfare in the region. There was also a general mobilization of the noble levy of the Ruthenians. The Tatars opted for the less risky road instead. Under Agi II Girai, that had been substituting Murai, whose reputation had collapsed after September the 11th, passing through Moldavia. So, as a matter of fact, still backing the Ottomans in Podolia, because they had to literally pass through at least. Podolia does not reach the Black Sea, but most of the ways, the safest ways, the most direct ones, open ground are from there, and therefore relieving Poland from at least an immediate threat, but also complicating a bit the story further south. Potocki was concentrating forces in Galicia as Halil Pasha was gathering his own. And there were also the new Tatar reinforcements coming to the Ottomans from Crimea and rapidly gaining initiative by rapidly invading Volhynia. These bands were very difficult to catch. They were backed by Ottoman horsemen led by Mustafa Aga and also former Polish Lipka Tatars led by the same defector Kinski. This was a pretty heavy blow because Volhynia was devastated, many inhabitants were captured, and lots of resources were brought back by the Tatars in the stores of the Kamenets fortress. Potocki, realizing that the power shift had occurred once again and the threat was in the south, acted quickly, moving his entire force, Poles, Cossacks, etc., towards the very Kamenets. The purpose was actually to intercept the Tatar raiders with all their prisoners and loot. That's why Potocki sends a vanguard commanded by Serakovsky to reconnoiter the enemy position and size to locate him and strike him. On November the 28th, 1683, near Zinkovo, that is some 40 kilometers away from Kamenets, so just a bit more than a day of march from the safe haven of Kamenets, a Polish, Lithuanian, Ukrainian force struck successfully an Ottoman Tatar column, managing to free almost 1,000 Volhynian prisoners and recovering basically all the stolen loot that this Islamic force had gathered. Those Ottomans and Tatars that had survived the clash were pursued by the Cossack light cavalry and massacred in large numbers by the local angered Ukrainian population. Mustafa Aga managed to save his skin and to come back to Kamenets. However, most of his troops had been either killed or scattered, and many defected as well. Potocki thus presses on and manages to capture another supply convoy directed to Kamenets. There were different Ottoman Tatar columns withdrawing from the ravaged areas, right? And let's say autumn finished at this point with a sort of Polish triumphal note that sort of managed to ransom many Ruthenians had been captured and killing some of the enemy forces. There was at this point a general sense of exhaustion. Normally, campaigns stopped at this point, but in the broader strategic balance, objectively, the forces to spend were still available. For a while, soldiers were allowed to rest, to replace horses and equipment. Some were disbanded even. However, Sierakovsky, along with some of the remaining Polish and Cossack cavalry, was stationed at the frontier with Moldavia. The purpose was monitoring Kamenets at the same time, and all with this was entailed the possibility of injecting, as we've seen, Stefan Petricheko into his native land and probably the Moldavian capital of Yashi. Potocki, from his side, traveled to Stanislavov, where he planned to spend the rest of the winter and also eventually meet with the king, coming back from the Viennese campaign. In 1683, Moldavia was ruled by the voivode George Duka. This was the voivode's third reign in the country, a testament to the great turbulence occurring. In fact, it was sort of poorly cohesive territory, frontier between the Ottomans, Transylvania. He had ruled from September 1665 to May 1666, from November 1668 to August 1672 already. And he had risen to the throne for the third time in November 1678, succeeding Anthony Rossetti. These were all, as we'll see now, appointees of the Sublime Porte, and there was a Moldavian boyar nobility that, of course, swung in allegiance depending on the circumstances. and himself had been backed in this third rule by the Ottomans, who endorsed him, and also as far as the extension of the Moldavian dominion was concerned. In fact, Duka had been able to gain control of the right bank of Ukraine in 1681. Right, he had done so by essentially bribing lots of local aristocrats, in spite of the heavy damage that this region had endured right during the previous wars with the Turks, etc. Duka had accompanied Kara Mustafa at the gates of Vienna with 4,000 Moldavian troops. During the campaign, Duka's wife Anastasia Dabica governed Moldavia, while the governor Draginitsi took care of the Ukrainian affairs, with Moldavian troops garrisoned in the right bank of the country. This is how fundamentally Moldavia had contributed to the Ottoman presence, also in Podolia, historically. There was an old alliance between Moldavia and the Tatars from Budjak that were essentially the former Polish Lipka Tatars settled by the Ottomans near the Dnestr River. There had been, as you know, an issue. Like Jan Sobieski had basically tamed the Lipka Tatars and reinstated their traditional autonomies after these had exceptionally rebelled, because otherwise they were incredibly faithful, following the harsher Catholic conditions on these religious minorities after the Counter-Reformation. And the Lipka Tatars had previously resisted the Ottoman attempts to lure them back into, let's say, this broader Islamic world, and they had to tell them nuts, because they said the Turks were just common thieves and criminals. But on that occasion, some of these Lipka means Lithuania, because most of them were settled there since the time of Witold, right? We're talking the 14th century. Had passed over to the Turks. Duka was also supported by the Ottoman garrisons of Bender, Tegina, and Bilorod, which at least would have intervened in his favor in times of trouble. Petri Chaiko, however, as long as he was still alive in Poland, naturally being backed by the Commonwealth to regain his Moldavian domain, was the main threat to Duka's rule, agitating the Moldavian boyars, and that had, of course, contacts with Poland and Petri Chaiko. This interferences, of course, could not be avoided. Many Moldavian boyars were subsidized by the Poles, who also promised them active military support in case of upheaval. So this Moldavian chronic instability was sort of an interesting political battlefield for everybody involved. Naturally, when the Ottomans were defeated at Vienna, such Moldavian instability increased, and given especially that Duka was in the Ottoman army at the time, of course, this seemed a good moment to try to fuel on the Moldavian anti-Ottoman feelings and to reinstall himself into the country. The papacy was very involved in all this as well. Rome contributed heavily, as you know, to the entire imperial Polish alliance, and would not forget to subsidize the same Cossacks, right? Especially as far as the fact their frontier and so therefore almost constantly belligerent condition against the Ottomans and the Tartars was concerned. Before leaving Krakow, Jan III, that had come back to Poland, appointed the nobleman Stefan Kinski as Cossack hetman, right? So probably the leader of the Ukrainian Cossacks, instructing him to take action and essentially starting levying troops from both the right and left bank of Ukraine. Kinski is an interesting figure, albeit most of his origins, youth, and early military career remain unknown. Before 1673, he became an associate of the hetman Petro Doroshenko. That year, he undertook 2 diplomatic missions to Warsaw, representing the Cossacks hetman before King Mikhail Korybut-Wisniewski. On February 25, 1673, the Polish Sejm granted nobility to Kinski, his 5 nephews, Atanasi, Vasil, Fyodor, Dmitry, and Ivan, and 3 other loyal Cossacks of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. However, on his return from Warsaw to Chechrin, that is today's Chechrin, Kinski was captured by Ivan Samolovich's men. He remained imprisoned until November 1674, when the King John III Sobieski intervened on his behalf. In February 1675, Dmitry Jerzy Wisniewski appointed him as deputy starosta of Nemyr. The following spring, he traveled to Moldavia to rescue his nephews and other family members from Ottoman captivity. As podstarosta, he also engaged in intelligence network, gathering information from Polish agents about Turkish and Tatar forces for hetman Dmitry Jerzy Wisniewski. The political landscape in right-bank Ukraine shifted in the latter half of 1676 when the Muscovites arrested Petro Doroshenko and appointed Ivan Samolovich as his successor, prompting a Turkish response. Yuri Khmelnytsky was released from captivity and named Prince of the Rus. Constantinople designated Nemyriv as the capital of the Khanate of Ukraine, but Kinski remained unconcerned about potential Ottoman or Tatar invasions in the town. On December 4, 1678, Colonel Gavrilo Nerbesky captured Nemyriv. It remains unclear whether Kinski left the town then before Nerbesky's arrival or stayed for some time after. There is also little information about his activities between 1678 and 1683, though he may have spent some time in Volhynia at the estate of Dmitry Wisniewski. Kinski's Ukrainian recruitment was slow, and it was not until mid-October that he gathered enough troops to advance into the right bank Ukraine, occupied by the Ottomans, forcing, by the way, Draginitsy, as we've seen with this local governor, depending on Moldavia and therefore in turn on the Ottomans, to retreat quickly and abandon several small fortresses held by, in fact, the Moldavian garrisons that we were describing before. Before launching his anti-Ottoman offensive, Kinski bolstered his forces, the bulk of which was constituted by Cossacks, and he enacted a reorganization of the cadres, especially by promoting experienced officers like the aforementioned Andrzej Moyla and the same Stanisky to colonels in charge of thus various regiments. And following this, Kinski, the hetman, directed his still growing army, because there were lots of Cossacks that were just joining a bit, more in a more anarchically autonomous way, let's say, and just also testing the ground. This was really typical, like at the fringe of the steppes. Like there were lots of groups that were sort of aggregating spontaneously, also depending on how much force was concentrated in order to be able to devastate thanks to the deterrence that it provided to the looters. The hetman's targets were the Ottoman garrisons at Bar and Medjugorje in Podolia. However, this Cossack force was unable to capture such strongholds. The main reason seems to have been a lack of artillery and engineers, which was a problem like in the broader Cossack forces, were generally less updated technologically than even their Polish counterparts, who were still relatively archaic compared to Western European military developments. If anything, it was the Turks who put up a fierce resistance, so as always that's the main reason. This prompted Kinski to change objectives, and rather than trying to capture these strongholds that didn't seem to be worth all that expenditure, decided to enter Moldavia. That obviously was a move coordinated to allow Petricecu to reinstall himself on the local throne. In fact, there were many Moldavian boyars who supported Kinski, increasing his forces to something as large as 20 to 30,000 men. We are in mid-November 1683, so this is a very strong force, like a regional scale. Kinski sends 10,000 of these forces, actually mounted Cossacks, mostly to pacify Budak, while he led the remainder against the Ottoman-held fortress of Bender. We talk about Cossack warfare. We can actually discuss it further in other videos. This was an incredibly mobile force, habituated again to cope against the nomads of the steppes. The Cossacks, just like the etymology is the same one of Kazakh, right? This originally were an actual Turkic or however nomadic people of the steppe that kept, say, dwelling in this frontier and gradually absorbed many actual Eastern Slavs that, in this sense, sort of brought their own sort of more Western bias to that, and this resulted in some sort of, again, quite agile mounted, say, cavalry that could dismount often. It's a bit like the dragoons, right, in conceptually, and these forces were quite useful, especially in this wild plains, as the Poles called them, as far as all this guerrilla operations was concerned, like sort of the unforgiving territory, the steppes, but also, forests, marshes, and so they were quite versatile forces. They weren't, again, so developed or, say, updated, but they made like great fighters. So Kinski focused on the Ottoman fortress of Bender now. During these operations, there is a veritable punitive expedition targeting the Tatars by the Cossacks that start massacring especially the Lipkas that, as we've seen, had, at least those who had betrayed the Commonwealth. Many of them, again, had, say, the ones who had remained loyal to it had distinguished even themselves at the Battle of Vienna. These ones siding with the Turks made really the end that their treacherous choice had deserved, right? There were also other Tatars that ended up, massacred. These were actually the ones coming back from Vienna, in part, and so because, as we've seen, were crossing Moldavia themselves, and they had been bolstering the Ottoman ranks in this circumstance. There were also many prisoners from the Tatars that were released and enlisted essentially into Kinski's army. And so there was a wide scale devastation carried out by the Cossacks, that were masters in this. No mercy was shown. Everything was set on fire. People were massacred. These local supporters of the Turks met with a terrifying fate. Eastern Europe is indeed historically possibly the single most traumatically violent place in the history of the continent. And these people were completely are that tough and that determined to resist to these hardships, historically speaking. And there is a passage by Jan Chrysostom Pasek, this is a Polish chronicle, says, Kinski and his Cossacks went there effortlessly, as all the better Tatar horses were occupied in Vienna. Consequently, he had ample time to burn and kill anyone who gathered in opposition to him. His forces grew as he liberated many prisoners who were present, while others from distant areas came to him upon hearing about this Christian army. The Cossacks showed no mercy, killing women, tearing children apart, and committing horrifying acts against them. It is said that he slaughtered 300,000 of them, naturally a great exaggeration, marching everywhere without fear of anyone. After returning, the Tatars saw their land devastated, their wives and children murdered, and their cattle and sheep taken away, which caused them to weep over this tragedy. Blip happens. Now, the assault on Bender by the Cossacks was also ultimately unsuccessful. Seemingly, the problem of lack of artillery really persisted at this point, a situation made worse at the beginning of December by the arrival of an Ottoman but mostly Tatar-made force at Bender, right, with the intention of relieving the fortress from the Polish, the Cossack siege. This force, by the way, was just a smaller part of the bigger Tatar army, really acting as a vanguard, right? The same Ali Giray and the Bujak Tatars with the Ottoman leaders Ali Bey and Yusuf Aga were with the core of the bigger part of the army. And there is a clash properly between Kinski's force and these Ottoman Tatars at Kisani, today's Kilia, Filagorn or Filogranum, where on December 5th, 1683, we understand that it was pretty cold in those places. In fact, there had been intense snow, which had hampered probably the entire offensive potential of basically anyone involved. Nevertheless, the Cossacks, with great impetus according to the sources, managed to get the upper hand and defeated the Tatars, the Tatar vanguard with their Ottoman leaders that were killed, including Ali Giray and Ali Bey. This was a clamorous Cossack success and revenge. In fact, sources said that the roads for 4 miles were filled with the bodies of slain Tatars, Turks, Janissaries, and Sipai. There is a bit of an exaggeration when Kinski claimed, writing to the Polish government, that none of his Cossacks suffered casualties during the Battle of Kisani. Indeed, the Ottoman army had not even completely been annihilated. The force basically had precipitously retreated, and the Cossacks had been pressing on them ferociously, but it wasn't like a full collapse, and there was prolonged fighting along the way, which shows also how, let's say, like the level of lightness and heaviness sometimes does make the deal. Like you're not really just as light with lighter troops to probably have this greater impact on the core of the enemy force that does not dissolve in their regard. Nevertheless, the Turks were badly beaten. They lost a lot of men and they withdrew. The Polish commissioner accompanying the Cossacks, Druszkiewicz, reported in 1683 that the mezhites and bar were burned, Nemirov was recaptured from the Ottomans, Bender was again besieged, and Budjak pacified. So this is actually a broader compendium of the campaign. The Tatar losses number at 10,000 or more, right, altogether. So that's more or less the scale of the engagement, which is actually a lot, especially like for these corners of southeastern Europe. As previously mentioned, Petricecu was awaiting for the right chance to enter Moldavia, and after this defeat suffered by the Ottomans, the Tatars, and the Moldavians, he was introduced by a small Polish force sent by Andrzej Potocki in Moldavia, where at the end of November, this is actually happening before the full collapse of the say the Ottoman front, let's put it in this way, because those Moldavians were also involved now in the east part, had been involved in Austria, in Hungary, and others were just in the east here confronting the Ukrainian Cossacks and the Poles. And so just like Poland was vulnerable while all its army was basically at Vienna, so at this point Moldavia was not actually committing the entirety of its forces, as we've seen, but very well predisposed towards Petricecu and his Polish support. In fact, in Botoszani, Petricecu is welcomed from boyars who had, by this point, officially deposed Duka and pledged their loyalty to the new voivode. By the end of the year, Petricecu's forces in Moldavia had swelled. Right, this allowed him to march on the same capital of Moldavia, Jassy. Meanwhile, Kinski was going on fighting in the cold weather, by the way, throughout winter, keeping up his pressure against the Ottoman strongholds and annihilating the various defenseless Tatar settlements. There wasn't actually a great deal of success, especially against the Turks. Right, there wasn't much, especially in the snow, with all the logistical difficulties you can imagine to carry out successful sieges, especially effective ones to begin with. A reason for which also an increasing amount of Cossacks that had been satisfied with enough loot came back to Ukraine. The Hetman was now in all dependent on the Polish support, reinforcements, money. The salaries concerned particularly his troops. That's the reason why they had starting to defect, given that even in the current situation there wasn't obviously too much wealth that could arrive there, nor Poland was, of course, like simply, throwing money at him. And so the situation by the end of December began to deteriorate. A Tatar force led by Aji II Girai, counting 10,000 plus several hundred Ottomans and 7 cannons, met with the Hetman's Cossacks. Kinski's also Cossack and Moldavian troops had began as seen to dwindle. They counted also likely less than their opponents, like less than 10,000 men. In a letter to Andrzej Potocki, Petricecu stated, "Cossacks here told us that there were no more than 5,000 of them, even though Kinski assured us many times that he had more than 40,000 under his command." So this was sort of a psycho towards the same allies, towards the same troops, to say, okay, we're enough, or because imagine even how these forces operated. Like, they weren't concentrated uniquely in one point, and so Kinski could play the card of we're actually more, even though he truly could not control more than what we said. There was a battle near the village of Tobak where the Cossacks and the Moldavians found themselves outnumbered, low on gunpowder and without cannons. Cannons in the steppes were a bit of a commodity. There weren't so many. Like Eastern Europe was, again, less developed. It had just more horsemen, light horsemen, and less artillery and heavy shock troops in general. But in this, say, harsh winter, you can imagine all the complications, even probably moving an army with artillery or whatever, that the few guns that they had been lost, dispersed or whatever. Nevertheless, there is tactics that the Cossacks and the Moldavians managed to enact, which is really typical of these places. We have seen it more famously for the Hussites, right? The Taborites, as a matter of fact, so much that Tabor, in part, we'll have to talk about that, but is associated properly with the idea of the wagon fortress. These things had been going on there for millennia. There was nothing actually, particularly novel that the Hussites did with these fortresses. There's been a lot of sort of elaboration on this, but the Cossacks were really mastered of this, right? Because they were habituated to operate in the steppe, in the open, without cover, and so it was completely normal for them to just form this protection against, especially properly the full nomads, the Tartars, the Mongols. In fact, even if hardly pressed by the Tatars, the Cossacks anchored to their wagon fort managed to retreat more or less safely towards Yashi. This is also quite telling because it shows how, of course, even the Tatar forces were not particularly heavy and they couldn't simply wear out like the entire Cossack army, but they, of course, there was a risk of that, and here the Cossacks were great at pulling this feat off. Unfortunately, though, on the night of January the 3rd to 4th, we are in 1684 now, the Moldavian boyars that had assisted Kinski decide to desert in large numbers. They realize that the situation is bad. They have reached Moldavia essentially, so they say, okay, we're going home. And here the regime change had already occurred in Moldavia, and it seemed like, at least as far as they were concerned, the situation. These were obviously the ones who had sided for Petricecu, and as far as their goal had been reached, like they didn't see much of a reason to continue this fight out there, right? Plus, on top of this defection, Kinski decided to leave his own army, right? He basically took all the cavalry and fled across the Prut River, leaving the rest of his forces behind, which, if you think about it, is insane. The remaining Cossacks in the field chose jointly, this was also their tradition, the Colonel Andrei Moila as their new hetman, because Kinski was just dead to them. And however, they couldn't do much but crossing the Prut River back to Ukraine themselves. In this, they weren't so successful, though, because the enemy naturally capitalized on this situation, and crossing a river is very dangerous. It obliges you to abandon your battle formation, to stretch out, and so this crossing is actually, like at least some managed to cross, but many Cossacks are killed, drowned, or captured. Some Cossacks actually escaped back to Yashi rather than to Ukraine, because they couldn't cross the Prut. The Tatars, by the way, in this weather did not pursue the Cossacks. Instead, they camped near Belgorod, and they essentially went on with their campaign instead, gradually. Kinski definitely hadn't made a great display of capacity, and of course he found himself in a difficult situation. He had been abandoned by the Moldavians, and he was infuriated with them for this defection. So he used this as an excuse to the Poles. It was a reasonable explanation, but he essentially reached the Polish border, requesting support to establish at least a defense force that could continue the war against the Tatars. Naturally, this entailed money that he asked Potocki in order to properly levy new troops. At that point, however, Potocki could not really help, and he had run out of resources, didn't have the full capacity of the king that, coming back finally from his Viennese campaign, did actually provide 100,000 zloty and fabric for uniforms to Kinski, which was, a valid support, showing sort of the good faith of, okay, yes, this was a debacle, but let's not make it worse by starting sort of an infighting. And the king settled the matter, of course, from the top of his authority. In all this, Petriceco, that naturally had not been stranger to what had happened, did, however, face now a new threat, because the Tatars had managed to gain the upper hand, and without the support of the Cossacks, the same situation in Moldavia was complicated. He had just a few banners of Polish cavalry, plus, of course, his Moldavian supporters. In any case, he was threatened by the Ottomans in that context, because he was the Polish puppet on the Moldavian throne. Duka, by the way, was about to return. He was in Transylvania, gathering the remnants of his army after the disastrous Viennese enterprise, but he did have some supporters in Moldavia, of course, still, and this situation was sort of conflagrating, because the same Moldavian boyars were starting to kill one another as a consequence. There was even a desperate attempt by Petriceco to require help from the Muscovy rather than from Poland-Lithuania, but this situation was in fact just showing how weak his position now was suddenly turning again. Potocki had not been able to help Kinski, so he wouldn't really help Petriceco either, especially now that he was installed as the voivode of Moldavia. So he was to be successful, he had to be on his own at that point. Not that the Poles were not helping him, but resources are not infinite in the first place. Consider that by this point the Cossacks were, as we've seen, deserting. The Polish army was basically just either disbanded or quartered in the winter camps. Nevertheless, Potocki managed to scrap together some small relief force. We're talking about several banners of panzerni, so the cuirass, the armored heavy cavalry, and the Rotmistrz Stefan Andrzej Dymidewski was placed in command of this contingent, appointed as colonel. Rotmistrz is one of the many, actually, German loans in the Polish military vocabulary since the Middle Ages. It comes from Rotmeister, right? And I discussed this in some videos regarding the German vocabulary influence among the Western Slavs. And now, of course, these Polish forces were mostly about this heavy cavalry, and that was also suited with light support, this sort of also Moldavian, Ukrainian warfare, etc. Dymidesky was an experienced commander. He served during the darkest hour of Poland, the Deluge years against Sweden. I made a video about the invasion of Poland by Charles X of Sweden, and that sort of were tough times. You can check out how difficult that was. And so Dymidesky was a trusted veteran. He had been at least nominally in charge of a Panzerny banner that had fought at Vienna. He had been actually commanded by his lieutenant Alexander Chonentovsky. Anyhow, he was, someone who knew how to handle military matters. Dymidesky, however, would also remain in Poland. Really, he commanded a Wallachian banner. Essentially, this was likely some private force. Wallachia was another interesting country, as you know, like they're between Transylvania and Moldavia. You don't know which one really is more, at this point, also restless because of the general situation. He had been within Potocki's forces to begin with, but he was later dispatched to aid, as we've seen, Petrichenko. And the strategy involved was attacking Duka in Transylvania, or at least waiting for him when he would enter the Moldavian territory. In fact, on Christmas 1683, learning that Duka was in Domneszli, Dymidesky led this group of Polish cavalrymen in a surprise attack against the Moldavians. And this was a very intense fight. There is Pasak's diary documenting the victory of Dymidesky's forces over the Moldavians led by Duka, that was captured in the action and sent to Poland, where he would die in captivity on March the 31st, 1685. This was a great surgical operation that allowed for Petrichenko to, at least have a bit more of fresh air to breathe. Dymidesky, after this action, moved to Roman, and from there he went out fighting the Tatars. Right, and in 1684, the beginning of the year, considering the general situation, Petrichenko decided that things were basically lost in Moldavia. Too many boyars were essentially realizing that for how heavy the blow that the Ottomans had suffered, especially in this theater, there wasn't much really changing. And therefore, Petrichenko leaves Iași. He relocates to Suceava, escorted on his journey because of the dangers of crossing the country with all these hostile nobility, by Dymidesky's forces. Consider that there were Tatars around as well, so again, was better to be locked and loaded. Until April of 1684, however, Iași was not abandoned by the Polish forces that had been installed there under Petrichenko. These were under the command of Stanislaw Kobylski, that was a lieutenant of Franciszek Jedrzejewski's Wallachian banner from the regular Polish army. These weren't many troops, were also typically made of the heavily armored element and the lighter one. There were also some dragoons that were some sort of between, at least medium cavalry, could dismount, as we've seen also mostly for, not necessarily fighting, but also as pioneers, pontooniers, etc. Again, check out this video made about the Polish-Lithuanian army. There were just 2 weak regiments altogether. There were some cannons sent by the Poles as they were returning from the Vienna campaign after the Moldavian candidate to the throne had been successfully installed, but it wasn't that much. At this point, by the way, after Duca's demise, Dumitrașcu Cantacuzino had become the new pretendant to the Moldavian throne. He was supported naturally by the Ottomans. There wasn't really much that the Cossacks at this point from the east could do, even just to help the Polish cause in Moldavia, as they were actually fighting against one another, as we've seen, because of the defections. The rearrangement of power was very typical of the Cossacks. Kinski's position also weakened in the general picture. The fact that he had really lost his army, he had abandoned them even, brought to his final demise in March 1684. He was really killed by his mutinous soldiers. This caused yet another collapse in the region, because at least as far as Kinski's forces were out there, doesn't matter how depleted, there was a capacity of intervention in Moldavia. After his death, so the one of a magnate that had so much experience of Ukrainian affairs, it was understood that Moldavia could not receive further help properly, and this is what prompted the Polish garrison in Jarzy to flee. Druszkiewicz escaped for his life, and after Kinski's death, Andrzej Moyla, backed by the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, became the new Ukrainian Cossack hetman. While this stabilized a bit the situation in Ukraine, Moyla was unable to return to Moldavia for any meaningful intervention, like linking up with Druszkiewicz or recovering some other support locally. It is really interesting to see, however, how much Ottoman power had shrunk after September 11th. So for the Poles to simply play with Moldavia like this, but it was ultimately a failure, in perspective. In mid-April 1684, Petrichayko was defeated for this reason, like the lack of other support, in spite of his, again, moving residence, at the Battle of the Larga River by his rival Cantacuzino. This is the reason why he had to fled Moldavia once again to Poland, where he actually would go on living until 1690. The new voivode of Moldavia, predictably, it's a bit like the story, we've seen it also for the video about medieval Moldavia, as a matter of fact, already at that time, and things throughout the centuries had remained more or less the same, really had a very short reign. In 1685, in fact, it was replaced by another Ottoman-backed candidate. There was Constantine Cantemir. This essentially settled the matter. There weren't, at this point, sufficient Polish troops in Podolia to even stop the Tatar raids in the spring of 1684. There wasn't also anything that the Poles could do to stop the Ottoman replenishment of the garrison and the stocks at Kamieniec Podolski. Potocki at this point did not receive enough funds. There wasn't any success also for this general lack of commitment. This is how everything went downhill. This situation remained relatively stalled, right? Podolia itself was not practically regained entirely by the Poles. This actually would bring in the new season, 1684, to a new war. And of course, there was a general commitment towards an Ottoman Empire was in difficulty by this point. In any case, Jan Sobieski was particularly dissatisfied with the situation. He was essentially already by January 1684 telling to Potocki that Kinski was sort of unreliable. And Jan Sobieski had done is possible for allowing Petrichescu to remain in charge in Moldavia, but all this greater plan fundamentally ran out of steam, and the situation simply degenerated to the point of not being savable. All right, so this is, if you want, in a sort of bitter way, the disappointing conclusion, at least, of this 1683-1684 campaign on the Podolian-Moldavian front. Initially, of course, the Ottomans and the Tatars were heavily battered. As we've seen, the Lipka Tatars were basically wiped out from the Podolian-Moldavian settlement after their betrayal. The Ottomans and also the Crimean Tatars, the Nogai horde, did suffer their share of losses. And in general, this of course helped the broader cause. The Ottomans were the ones who suffered the most of this overall, as they were under pressure from, following the disaster at Vienna. And so we can say that in spite of the losses, also these operations contributed to weaken the Ottomans, opening, however, new questions also in Ukraine. The later history is sort of depressing to an extent. However, we will see how the same Habsburgs, for example, played in this game, and so everything remains intertwined with a broader picture. The characterization of the various types of troops is really spot on for how we know them, like the Poles operating with heavy and light cavalry as regular forces, essentially bringing in a few cannons, but not managing to provide the Cossacks with, say, significant support because of all the sort of strategic logistical difficulties, the costs involved with that. The Ottomans fight with, again, this more regular but sort of overall lighter, more not really foot-based forces. They had the Tatars, of course, but I mean, we have seen there were the Janissaries as well. We find, however, feudal Sipais too. They weren't so significant. The Poles overall, if it had been just for their own panzerni, were definitely the ones with the heavier, consistency. And you have the Moldavians too, that fight sort of similar ways between the two, and not contributing excessively, but still being there. You have the Lithuanians that come in some measure, but of course Poland had the lion's share of the entire balance. As we've seen, there were difficulties to mobilize properly the Lithuanians for this campaign. So this is the whole picture, a tragic one of also betrayal, of mutinies, of harsh conditions. So all something that went on also for a long time, as you understand, before this untangled, right, itself, and with this sort of devastating result, but still something again that added to the general resources spent and readjusted a bit some balance. For today, however, I stop it here. We'll keep talking about the 1683 campaign. For today, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.